Welcome to Dance Playing, everyone. I'm Edward, and as always, with me is the brilliant Lily. We're going to be taking a look at the life and career of Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
I think you'll find this deep dive extra interesting because we're not just covering those basic biographical details, but we're also going to look at some political analysis and even some international perspectives on Poilievre. It's really fascinating to see how he is perceived both within Canada and on the world stage.
You're right. I was going through the sources, and I have to admit there are some surprising things about his background and his rise to prominence.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to start his early life.
Yeah.
It's not often you hear about a political leader who was adopted.
Right. Not just adopted. He was actually born with a different name. It's a really interesting story.
It is. He was born to a teenage mom who was planning to name him Jeff. But life had other plans. He was adopted shortly after birth by two school teachers, Marlene and Donald Poilievre, who gave him the name Pierre.
It really makes you wonder how being raised by two school teachers shaped his worldview.
It's interesting to see how those themes of family values and individual opportunity run through his political messaging. I think his upbringing might have played a big role in shaping his political ideology.
That's interesting you say that, because his story is often presented as this classic paperboy to parliament narrative.
Yeah, and it's a compelling one. He was active in the Conservative Club at university, started working for political figures really early on, and then bam, youngest MP ever at just 25 years old.
That is impressive.
Yeah.
But there's a paradox, isn't there? Because even though he has this long political career, he still manages to cultivate this outsider image. How does he do that?
I think a lot of it has to do with his communication style. He is known for being very direct and confrontational, which makes him stand out, from a lot of career politicians who often come across as more cautious and calculated.
Yeah, he is definitely not afraid to get into those heated debates and, deliver some pretty pointed criticisms.
Exactly. We see that over and over in the sources. The Fair Elections Act, his approach to the chief electoral officer, the Just Inflation campaign. These are all moments where he really went head-to-head with his opponents.
It seems like that style, while potentially polarizing, is a big part of his appeal to a certain segment of the population.
Absolutely. For some people, it's refreshing to see a politician who's willing to speak his mind and, challenge the status quo. They see him as someone who's fighting for them, someone who's not afraid to take on the establishment.
And that seems to resonate especially well in the current political climate, where there's a growing distrust of institutions and a real desire for authenticity.
Definitely. And speaking of appealing to a certain segment of the population, let's talk about his landslide victory in the Conservative leadership race. He really tapped into something powerful there.
He did. Reducing government size, cutting taxes, addressing the housing crisis. These were his key promises, and they clearly resonated with a large portion of the Conservative base.
And what's interesting is how his victory fits into this larger trend. We are seeing globally the rise of populism and anti-establishment sentiment.
So he's not just riding a Canadian wave, but maybe a global one.
Exactly. Think about it. His focus on economic issues, his plain-spoken language, his attacks on elites, these are all themes we see resonating with populist movements all over the world.
It makes you wonder, what is it about this particular moment in time that makes these ideas so appealing?
Well, I think there's a sense that the old systems aren't working anymore, that the traditional parties have failed to address the concerns of ordinary people. People are looking for something different. Someone who speaks their language, understands their struggles.
And Poilievre, with his focus on things like the cost of living and those promises to, axe the tax, seems to be positioning himself as that alternative.
He is, and he's doing it very effectively, especially through his use of social media.
Right. He's really bypassing traditional media and going straight to the people, using platforms like YouTube and TikTok to connect with voters on a much more personal level.
And he's not just using social media to share talking points. He's actually having conversations, engaging with people, responding to comments.
It's a very different approach from that traditional top-down style of communication that we're used to seeing from politicians.
Exactly. And it seems to be working. He's building a following, generating enthusiasm, and creating a sense of community amongst his supporters.
It's pretty remarkable to see how he's using these new tools to reshape the political landscape.
It is, and it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out long term. Is this a passing trend, or are we witnessing a real shift in how politicians connect with voters?
It's a question worth considering, but for now, it's pretty clear that Poilievre is leading this new wave of political communication, and he's showing other politicians how it can be done.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, there's another piece of Poilievre's platform that's worth diving into, his critique of wokeism.
Right. He has been very vocal about what he sees as an excessive focus on identity politics and political correctness.
And this critique really resonates with a part of the population that feels like their values are being ignored or even attacked by, the political and cultural elite.
It's interesting because it's not just a Canadian debate. This is happening all over the world. There's this pushback against what some people see as an overreach of progressive ideology and a desire to get back to a focus on more traditional values.
Exactly. And Poilievre is tapping into that sentiment. He's positioning himself as a defender of those traditional values, someone who's willing to stand up to the woke mob and fight for the common man.
And this all leads us to what is probably the most significant development in Canadian politics lately, Justin Trudeau's resignation.
Yeah, this is a game changer for Poilievre. With Trudeau gone, he's the clear frontrunner to be the next prime minister.
The polls are pretty remarkable.
They are. We're seeing a huge swing towards the Conservatives, and Poilievre's own popularity is soaring. It seems like Canadians are ready for a change, and they're looking to him to lead the way.
It's incredible to think about this man who started out as this young, ambitious politician with a talent for, fiery rhetoric, is now potentially on the verge of leading Canada.
It is. His story is far from over. We've just scratched the surface of his political journey, and there's so much more to explore. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll go deeper into his economic policies, his approach to social issues, and what his potential leadership could mean for the future of Canada. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Pierre Poilievre.
It's amazing to see how his story has unfolded, isn't it? From such a unique beginning to this incredible rise in politics, there's definitely been a lot of twists and turns along the way.
Absolutely. And in this part, I'm really excited to take a closer look at his economic policies, and how they're shaping the conversation, not just within the Conservative Party, but across Canada.
Going through all these sources, one thing that stood out to me was this idea of a shifting political paradigm. It's like Poilievre is sensing something deeper, a real realignment of priorities. What do you think about that?
I think you're right on the money there. He's really shifted the focus onto economic concerns, affordability, inflation, the cost of living. These are like bread and butter issues that really hit home for so many Canadians.
He's basically saying, hey,
Yeah.
let's get back to the basics, making sure people can afford a decent life, put food on the table, have a roof over their heads.
Exactly. And that message resonates so deeply, especially with younger voters who are facing, a really tough economic reality. They see in Poilievre someone who gets their struggle, someone offering solutions, not just rhetoric.
And those solutions are rooted in his core economic beliefs.
Yes.
Right? Smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation.
Precisely. He's a strong believer in the power of free markets and individual liberty. His argument is that by shrinking the government's role and empowering people, we can unlock economic growth that benefits everyone.
But of course, there are critics who say this kind of approach, could disproportionately benefit the wealthy, potentially at the expense of social programs, and those who are most vulnerable.
That's a valid concern. And it's a debate that's going on not only in Canada, but around the world. How do we balance economic growth with social safety nets? How do we ensure that everyone has a fair shot? It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
Which takes us back to those big questions we touched on before. What kind of impact would Poilievre's policies actually have on different groups in Canada? Could his approach lead to more inequality? Or would it be like a rising tide that lifts all boats?
Those are the tough questions we need to grapple with. It's crucial to look at the evidence, analyze potential outcomes, and have, open and honest debates.
And speaking of debate, that's another thing that makes Poilievre so fascinating. His communication style. He's bold, direct, not afraid to ruffle feathers. It's a stark contrast from that polished, often evasive style you see with so many politicians.
Absolutely. He's really mastered this art of using clear language, cutting through the jargon, and connecting with people on a deeper level. And his command of social media allows him to bypass those traditional media filters and speak directly to voters.
He definitely has a way with those memorable sound bites like Axe the Tax or Just Inflation. They just stick with you.
Exactly. That's a key part of his strategy. He understands the power of concise messaging, framing the conversation in a way that connects with people.
But here's what I find interesting. Despite this combative style, he's actually attracting new members to the Conservative Party, people who might not have fit the traditional conservative mold.
That's a really crucial observation. It suggests his appeal goes beyond just those typical partisan lines. He's tapping into this wider sense of dissatisfaction with the establishment, this hunger for change, for someone who speaks to their anxieties and aspirations.
And that desire for change is fueled in part by his constant criticism of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. He's positioned himself as the anti-Trudeau, the champion of everyday people against those elites, the defender of traditional values against what he sees as, excessive woke ideology. It's a powerful narrative, and it's clearly resonating.
And it's resonating not just within Canada. We're seeing his message gaining traction internationally, particularly among conservatives in the U.S. and elsewhere. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a kind of shared political language emerging globally, the rise of populism, the backlash against globalization, a renewed emphasis on national identity. Poilievre's message really aligns with these trends.
His focus on economic nationalism, his skepticism of some international institutions, his defense of traditional values, it all speaks to a certain segment of voters who feel left behind by rapid social and economic changes.
Exactly. They see in him a successful example of how to push back against what they perceive as the excesses of progressivism, a model for winning elections by appealing to a base that feels overlooked or marginalized.
And his mastery of social media, bypassing those traditional gatekeepers of information that's inspiring conservative movements all over the world, it's a playbook that others are watching and trying to replicate.
It's pretty amazing to think that a Canadian politician, once relatively unknown outside of Canada, is now becoming this global figure shaping the conversation on the right. It's a testament to the power of ideas, of effective communication, and of this shifting political landscape.
For sure. As we move into the last part of our deep dive, we'll really explore what a Canada led by Pierre Poilievre might actually look like, the opportunities, the challenges, and the potential impact on Canadian society. It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
We'll also look into some of the criticisms and concerns surrounding his policies and his style of politics. There's still a lot to uncover, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our Deep Dive's final part. It's been really interesting exploring Pierre Poilievre's life, his policies, and his communication style, and even his global impact.
Yeah, we've covered so much ground. And now I think the big question, what would a Canada under Prime Minister Poilievre actually look like? It's definitely generating a lot of buzz.
It really is a future with a lot of possibilities. So let's start with the economy. We've talked about, his push for smaller government, lower taxes, deregulation. What concrete impacts could those policies have?
Well, his supporters believe these policies would actually unleash, a whole new wave of economic growth, create jobs, and make Canada much more competitive on that global stage.
It's interesting, right? They often look back to historical examples like the U.S. under Reagan or the U.K. under Thatcher, where similar policies led to, periods of significant economic growth.
Exactly. But like any economic approach, there are always critics, People who are a bit more cautious about Poilievre's ideas worry that they could end up benefiting the wealthy more than anyone else, and possibly even at the expense of the middle class and people who are already struggling.
Yeah, they're concerned that cuts to social programs and public services would hurt those who need them most, maybe leading to more inequality and social unrest.
It's that classic debate, trickle-down economics versus a more hands-on approach. Both sides have valid points, and it's a debate that's definitely going to intensify as we get closer to that next election.
And how about social issues? We talked about Poilievre's critiques of wokeism and his call for common sense solutions. How would that actually play out in terms of policy?
That's the question a lot of people are asking. Could we see a reversal of some of those progressive policies on things like LGBTQ rights, climate change, or multiculturalism?
It's definitely something Canadians are paying close attention to, especially those who see these policies as, really vital for a just and fair society.
But then there's the other side, people who feel that some of these policies have gone too far, that they don't represent the everyday values and priorities of most Canadians.
It's a complex issue. Any leader would need to approach it carefully. Poilievre, if he becomes prime minister, would need to find a balance that addresses everyone's concerns.
And he'll have to manage the potential for more division within Canada. His more combative style and willingness to, jump into those heated debates has already drawn criticism. Some worry that it could further divide Canadians based on their political beliefs.
Right. It raises the question of whether his style might alienate moderate voters or those who prefer a more collaborative, less confrontational style of politics.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about international relations. We've talked about those comparisons between Poilievre and other populist leaders around the world. So how might that affect Canada's role on the world stage?
It's an important question considering Canada's history as a middle power. Our focus on diplomacy and reliance on global trade. Would we see a move toward isolationism? Or would Poilievre look for new partnerships with countries that share similar views?
It's hard to say for sure, but his criticisms in the past of certain international institutions and his emphasis on national interests suggest there could be a shift in Canada's foreign policy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that a potential Poilievre leadership presents both exciting possibilities and, potential challenges for Canada. He's a charismatic and well-spoken leader with a clear vision for the country.
Absolutely. His policies and his leadership style could really reshape Canadian society in some big ways. But whether those changes are positive or negative in the end, well, that's a question each Canadian needs to think about for themselves.
Exactly, and that's what we always encourage our listeners to do. Keep exploring these issues, have thoughtful conversations, and make informed choices about the future of Canada.
And for those who want to keep learning about Pierre Poilievre, we've got tons of information on our website.
That's right. Head over to www.dansplain.xyz for all the latest updates, in-depth articles, related products, and so much more. We're always adding new stuff to keep you in the loop.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time, and until then, keep those minds curious.